looking at the effects of the Arab settlement into the coast of East Africa. So after these people settling into East Africa, there were a number of things that changed. There are some things that changed positively and negatively. So we have some positive and negative consequences of the Arab settlement into the coast of East Africa. So the contact between the Arabs and the coastal people had reached far-reaching the political, economic, and the social effect. So some of these were positive and the others were negative. So Arabs, on their arrival into East Africa or at the East African coast, they brought both positive and negative consequences. So we shall see that some of them, Africans benefited from them, others did not. So on their arrival, the Arab migrants imposed themselves as the rulers over the local Africans, making them lose their independence. The Shiraz dynasty took over the Chirwa, while the Mazuli dynasty ruled Mombasa, what we call Busaidi dynasty, and later Zanzibar. So Arabs, on their coming into East Africa, they made Africans to lose their self-rule or total independence. So Africans lost their independence to the hands of the Arabs. The Arabs, after taking over some of the African territories, they ended up making Africans to be under their rule. So that is the first effect, that Africans lost their independence to the Arabs after them settling into East Africa. So there were also intermarriages between the local people and the Arabs. Intermarriages. When Arabs came into East Africa, they married the African women that they found at the coast. When they married them, they gave birth to the new race called Swahili. So Swahili was another race which came up after the intermarriages between the Arabs and the coastal people. And from Swahili culture, we got what we call Swahili language. So it gave birth to a new race after them amalgamating with the coastal women. So intermarriages were also seen as an impact of the Arabs coming into East Africa. So with the birth of Swahili people, the Swahili culture actually revolted at the coast, and it was mixed up with the Bantu and the Arab culture. So the new culture came with the new language called Kiswahili. So Arabs coming into East Africa led to the birth of new culture called Swahili and the new language called the Swahili. And Swahili is so common in Tanzania, Kenya, and the other parts of East Africa, and even the entire Africa. Swahili is so common. So when these people came into East Africa, they gave birth to a new race and a new language, which is now later actually is now, even in the present day, it is used, even Arabic. So it gave birth to the new culture and the new language. Still, the Arabs coming into East Africa led to the introduction of new styles of building or architecture. So at the coast, local people started to build what they call the flat-topped houses, made out of stones and bricks without the so-called, remember in the past, people used to build what we call the hearthy, the houses in forms of huts. They used to establish huts, the use of spear grass and etc. But time came, there was the transformation. Arabs introduced what they call the flat-topped houses, which Africans later on adopted, and still in the coast they trained Africans the construction styles, and these they adopted them, and later on they became new constructors in East Africa. So local people adopted the Arabic way of dressing. From men, they started to put on what we call the kansu, turbans, capes, and the sandals. And women adopted what they call dressing of putting on silk dresses, veiling, and the shariat. So new styles of dressing were adopted, and this is on both sides, the men and still the women. Then still there were different foods introduced. Food was introduced, new types of foods were introduced, and the sitting style during the eating, what we call the cross legs. So when Arabs came into East Africa, they came with new types of food. Look at the rice. They came with the rice, and later on they introduced new cooking styles, and from the cooking style, new foods were introduced. Look at the so-called when pilau, the kind of rice, when they prepare rice in form of pilau, which is most liked by many Africans. So they introduced new Muslim habits of eating and new Arabic foods like pilau, chapati, and new culture of fasting, sitting cross legs, and so on and so forth. So their coming also led to the introduction of new forms of currency like the cowrie shells. So when the Arabs came in the trade, that is the Indian Ocean trade, they introduced what they call the cowrie shell, new currencies in the trade. The system in the beginning was barter, goods for goods, services for services. Time came, they introduced what they call the cowrie shells. From the cowrie shells, we got what they call the coins. So things started to transform from one step to another. The Islamic system of administration was introduced. Sharia law was introduced and used in administration. So the Islamic title like Sheikh, Sultan, Sheikhat, and the practice like circumcision, fasting, and many others were adopted by the Africans. Another one. There was also growth and development of coastal towns. So coastal towns developed due to the fact that Arabs came into East Africa. The coastal towns such as Chirwa, Sofara, Marindi, Mombasa, Zanzibar, these coastal towns developed into major towns later on after the Arab settlement into East Africa. So the coming of the Arabs led to the development of the coastal towns. Sofara developed into a major town, Malindi developed into a major town, Mombasa into a major town, Chirwa into a major town. These towns developed due to the fact that trade activities that were conducted by the Arabs developed, and later on they led the boosting of their economy, making their development inevitable. There was population increase in Africa with the Arabs coming into East Africa. The population increased and later on led to the production of cheap labor. So Africans increased in number due to the fact that they intermarried with the Arabs and they gave birth to new races, new tribes, new people, and later on the population had to grow, and with the development of the trade, things like agriculture, fishing actually developed, because now the people had increased in the activity. Still, we have new crops were introduced at the coast of East Africa. There were foods of the Atlantic origin like rice, wheat, sugarcane, bananas, and among others. So coastal people started growing these crops. After the Arabs coming into East Africa, they came with such crops which Africans adopted, and later on they were also used as trade commodities when it came to trade. So the Arabs also introduced and encouraged what they call the use of human feces as manure, so as to improve on farming. So they introduced new farming systems, new farming styles in order to boost farming. So they said now, this time around, human feces can be used as what we call manure. So this was done in order to improve on the fertility of the African soils. Some of the soils of Africa had got exhausted due to the excess and continuous farming. But later on, Arabs introduced a new kind of manure which Africans were encouraged to adopt. Islam was introduced and it was spread at the coast. Many people along the coast became Muslim because of their contact with the Arabs. So Arabs were in close contact with the Africans. Africans that were interested, that Africans that wanted to trade with the Arabs. Arabs told them that in order for them to get goods from them, they had to first convert into Christianity. There is a man in West Africa called Samore Toure. Samore Toure established his Mandinka Empire in 1860s. But for him to get guns that he used in the process of state expansion, he had to convert from being a traditional worshipper to a Muslim. And from there, Samore Toure loved Islam and he made his state what we call a caliphate. So from there, Samore Toure associated with other Arabs, with other Muslim brothers, Al-Ajdan Fodio, Uthman Fodel, and these were the people that participated in the 19th century jihad movement in West Africa. So come back to East Africa. So people wanted to trade with the Arabs. They had to first convert into Islam. And this later role made them to get chances of getting goods from the Arabs like guns and gunpowder, which kings and kingdoms used in state expansion and formation. Quranic schools or Islamic schools were built by the Arabs in the process of what we call expansion of Islam. These Quranic schools were used where Africans used to go for Quranic studies, over Quran studies. So schools that were teaching is Quran, they were set by the Muslims, and people used to go there for lectures, for studies, for them to learn about the Quran, how to read it, and later on how to interpret it. The coming of the Arabs led to the development of slave trade on the coast of East Africa. So Africans started hunting fellow Africans to be sold as the exports to the Arab countries altogether. So they got their fellow Africans more so the rob lakers, and these were sold as slaves, and Africans were given rewards in form of guns and gunpowder. Different kings became rich from the trade, and therefore we credit Arabs for having developed slave trade which was going on at the coast of East Africa. So the increased demand for slaves increased the slave raiding, welfare, and the insecurity not only at the coast but also in the entire East African coast. So because of the demand for slaves by the Arabs, raidings increased due to the fact that people wanted to acquire slaves, the acquisition of slaves. So slaves were highly demanded by the slave in the countries that were interested in them. However, we shall see that time came after the outbreak of the what we call Industrial Revolution that started in Britain. Slaves became useless, and after them becoming useless, they were later deported to Africa. And some of the countries that these slaves were deported to, we have Liberia. Liberia is called a country of freed slaves. We have Ethiopia. So the Liberians were settled in Liberia, Ethiopia, where the slaves were taken there, and this later role brought what we call tension among the Africans. Still, the coming of the Arabs into East Africa contributed to the rise of what we call depopulation in East Africa due to slave raidings and wars. They used to raid, and in the process of raiding, many people were killed, others were captured as prisoners or slaves, and they were taken to slave markets where they were sold, and Africans were given money, those who were actively involved in the act of raiding. Lastly on this, guns and gunpowder were introduced in Africa as a trade commodity. So whoever that wanted to acquire guns from the Arabs had to convert into Islam, and later on these people, after them being given guns, they used the guns in state expansion and formation. More so, the kings got guns from the Arabs, and they later on used them in state formation, whereby they used to attack weaker neighbors, defeating them, conquering them, and grabbing powers from them. So there are many consequences in line with the Arabs coming to East Africa, but let us stop there with these effects. But still, more are still there that you can add on those that we've explained. Have a good day.